All right, so here we go. CRP general sign up, why everybody's here today. What we're gonna do is kind of just talk about the basics of the program. We're gonna go through eligibility, the land and program eligibility, the options that producers and landowners have for planting their cover types, kind of a summary of those covers, pros and cons, and then the considerations that the landowners need to take when thinking about what to choose. And then, like I said, we have plenty of time at the end for questions. And before we get into the meat of this, we want to make sure and go over some acronyms that kind of get thrown around, but I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of what we were talking about. So CRP is Conservation Reserve Program, why we're all here. The USDA is the United States Department of Agriculture, which has two agencies, the Farm Service Agency, FSA, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. Those two agencies work on CRP. Pheasants Forever will a lot of times say PF, and then like I said, Cody and myself are farm bill biologists, so sometimes we'll mention FBVs. And then when we get into the cover types, sometimes you'll hear CP1, CP2, which basically is just it's a conservation practice, and then the number is the type. So just so everybody's all on the same page. So what is CRP? CRP is a land conservation program that's administered by the Farm Service Agency. In exchange for that a yearly rental payment, the farmers that are enrolled in the program are agreeing to take environmentally sensitive and marginal land from their ag production and plant species that improve environmental health and quality. Contracts are 10 or 15 years in length, and the long-term goal is to reestablish valuable land cover that helps improve water quality, prevent soil erosion, and then reduce the loss of wildlife habitat. Farm Service Agency administers CRP, while the technical support functions are provided by several different folks. NRCS is one. The Wisconsin DNR foresters help with the tree plans. Local soil and water conservation districts, county folks, and then there's non-federal technical assistance providers like those of us at PF. Some of the benefits of the program: producers that are enrolled receive annual rental payments that are based on the soil types that are out in the field. There is cost sharing available, up to 50% for establishment, for seed costs. And then the fields that are enrolled in CRP maintain an ag tax status while they're under that contract. And then also, additionally, you have habitat creation and then that protection of those environmentally sensitive areas. So just to kind of walk through the timeline of what would happen if you would like to enroll. So the sign up opened on January 4th and is open now. So consulting your local FSA office is kind of the place to start. Producers come in and talk with FSA and put together an offer. And then those offers need to be submitted by February 12th that go into the pool nationwide for ranking. And basically, when you're looking at your offer, you're trying to put together an offer that has the most points. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Producers that have accepted offers are then notified, and then contracts are signed with FSA in the springtime here in 2021. Then during the early summer, then NRCS and Pheasants Forever staff will design a conservation plan, which is the seed mix and what you're planting, where you're planting. Kind of walk through some of that. And then the producers will review and sign that conservation plan by July 16th. The contract then begins on October 1st. And depending on the cover type that you choose and what you've discussed with NRCS and the Pheasants Forever staff with your conservation plan, your planting can begin after that. And I'm going to turn it over to Ian now to discuss the eligibility side of things.
Thank you, Britta, and hello to everyone. As Britta said, my name is Ian Kraus, and I am an agricultural program specialist at the Wisconsin State Office for the Farm Service Agency. I want to take just a few minutes and talk about some of the eligibility requirements that we do have, and really what you can expect when you contact your local FSA county office to start the sign-up process. The first eligibility requirement I want to talk about is land ownership. Producers must have owned or operated the land in question for at least 12 months prior to the end of the enrollment period, unless the land was acquired through the previous owner's passing, foreclosure, or if you purchased the land for purposes outside of placing it to CRP. Note that all landowners listed on the deed will need to be listed on the CRP contract. They can be listed at 0% shares, but they will need to be listed. If you have not owned your land for 12 months, you can contact your local FSA county office to see if your situation is an eligible exception. Next slide, please. So all CRP offers do require that the land meets our crop history requirement. This means the fields have been planted to a commodity grain in 4 of 6 years between 2012 to 2017. We can go further back to 2006 to verify that the land is planted to a rotation with alfalfa or other multi-year grasses or legumes as needed. But if you have been planting to a standard corn and soybean rotation, it should be pretty straightforward. I'd like to note that approved prevent plant claims also count as cropped for eligibility purposes. The general sign-up also requires that the land meet one of 3 additional land eligibility criteria. The first is to be land that is currently enrolled in CRP and will expire on September 30th of this year. If you meet that, you're good. The second one, if you're also eligible if you're located in a conservation priority area, which you can see on the map. So if the land you're offering is located in either that blue or orange color, you would meet one of these eligibility criteria. The final one that we'd be looking at is if you're not an expiring or you're outside of this conservation area, you must have an erodibility index score of 8 or greater. This erodibility score will be determined by the top 3 soils present on your offer, and it is calculated through our Terra software. So as you're going through that sign-up process with the county office, they will be able to let you know what that score is. I would just like to quick note that hardwood tree practices, the CP3A, are only eligible to be enrolled one time. Next slide, please. So what can you expect when you contact your local FSA office, and what should you have prepared for that? Well, I can say that the process will vary from office to office. I do anticipate the first conversation will be a lot of information gathering from both sides. The office will want to make sure that we do have your current contact information in our system, and we will want to locate your land on our FSA map. So if you do know your farm and tract number, that'll make the process a lot easier. If you don't, no problem, we'll work through that with you. A big portion of this conversation will revolve around discussing your offer and what you want to do. If you do have practices in mind or you are looking to solve any specific conservation goals, let the office know that. Remember that the general sign-up is a competitive process and the offers are ranked nationwide. The cover you do select, that'll be the single most important factor determining your offer's rankings. During this time, the county office will likely discuss the expectations we have for participants involved in CRP, making sure you're aware that you have to maintain the cover that you offer. You'll have to manage it for any weeds or invasive species. And if you do have a prairie planting, there should be no trees growing in it. So depending how complex your offer is, and if you want to do multiple conservation practices in a single field, they may be able to create the offer with you over the phone at that time and tell you your soil rental rate and your erodibility index score right away. Both of these values are determined by the 3 most predominant soil types on the offer. If it is going to be a more complicated process and figuring out where you want those practices split. They might send you the FSA map and have you sketch out kind of what you're envisioning that you want to do. You know, throughout this, the county office will also have to verify your eligibility. So they may check with the county land records to see if ownership information is available. If it's not available, they may ask you for a copy of your deed. They will look at your crop history to verify that you do qualify with eligible cropland. And then if you are applying as a trust, LLC, or another entity, they will ask for documentation to show who has signing authority and the members present in that entity or associated with it. I do anticipate that throughout this process, the county office will be mailing or emailing some of these different forms to verify you do meet some other requirements we have, including the adjusted gross income, that you're complying with highly erodible land and wetland conservation certification, and any payment limitation requirements, as well as sending the CRP contract paperwork for signature when that is ready. The county office will need to receive all these documents before they can officially submit your offer on February 12th. So that deadline, as I said, is February 12th. After this date, the national office will close the sign up and set that acceptable environmental benefits index score. So any offer that meets or exceeds that score will be deemed as acceptable, and the county office at that time would reach out and provide you the information that we need to continue on with the next steps. That is all I have for you right now. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know or ask them at this time. But I want to thank you all for joining and all of you for your interest in conservation.
All right, well, if there aren't any eligibility questions, then we can keep going. We're gonna go through some cover types. So I'll turn it, oh, sorry, Ian, is there a question?
I see some in the chat.
All right.
If I'm converting my cover from a CP1 to a higher conservation practice, like a CP25, so that would be from an introduced grass mix to a rare and declining habitat, and am I allowed to begin working on my contract prior to October 1st? That is a good question. And I don't know if, Cody, if you want to talk about a little bit about when you do that conversion, what kind of steps will need to be taken, and I can get back with that process a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess first off, Ian, is that an allowable thing? Can you start prior to the contract start date?
I would reach out to your specific county office before starting any transitions or doing any plantings. Depending on what you're doing, a lot of it is not allowed. In some instances, we have some room to plan stuff ahead, but I would definitely recommend reaching out before you do start any plantings or changing of cover.
Okay. I'll touch on the conversion of cover later in terms of site prep and things like that, but from the eligibility standpoint was the question.
Another question, my contract expired in 2019 and was not re-enrolled. My cover is still established. Can I re-enroll this sign up? So in that situation, as long as you were maintaining your cover as if it were still in CRP, you would meet our crop history. So you would be able to re-enroll as the existing stand. I would note that if you have a tree practice, this would not be the case. So depending on the practice you have and what the cover out there looks like, you could submit this again with the existing stand, or if you wanted to change practices or enhance, that would be on the table as well.
So it looks like that's all our questions on eligibility for now. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Cody here, who's going to kind of walk through some of our cover types.
All right, I will start off where Ian left off a little bit with the ranking considerations. So like we've mentioned before, this is a general sign up. It's competitive nationwide. All the offers are scored or ranked on their Environmental Benefits Index, or EBI. There's really 6 main categories that make that up. Wildlife habitat, water quality, erosion, long-term benefits, air quality, and cost. Realistically, the producer can only change 2 of these factors, what cover type that they are going to plant and what rental payment they're willing to accept for the CRP. So as we kind of go through all the cover types here through the next few slides, be keeping in mind those ranking scores as we're talking about that. So the cover type options for the general sign up are kind of listed there. We did leave one of them off. It looks like CP12 wasn't included in our list, which is a food plot. So I'll touch on that right away, just saying that food plots are eligible through CRP, but there are restrictions on what you can plant and what percentages you can plant them in. So personal recommendation is to typically leave food plots out of your offer and plant them on your own, but they are an option. Starting kind of with our most basic practice, the CP1 introduced grasses, and it's a good picture there of what CP1 looks like after a few years, typically just dominated by brome or Kentucky bluegrass. Might get a little bit of milkweed and goldenrod that come in, but pretty low diversity on that. So the CP1 introduced grasses are obviously going to be our lowest cost to establish. They're very similar to a hayfield planting. Seed mixes are usually around the $50 range per acre for that. The area that we see these working the best is really steep slopes, but in reality, they'll grow anywhere. I say steep slopes typically because they're quick to establish and do a good job of erosion control. One of the benefits from a landowner standpoint is that they don't really require a mid-management activity. So on all CRP practices, or I should say most CRP practices, in the middle of the contract, the 5th or 6th year on a 10-year is going to be some form of management activity required, burning, mowing, haying, grazing, that sort of thing. This one does not require anything like that, but as it was mentioned before, it is still the landowner's responsibility to annually inspect and maintain the property for invasive noxious weeds, woody encroachment, things like that. It typically on a CP1, there's a pretty low long-term wildlife habitat value. Like I said, it's kind of just a hayfield, and it has pretty low plant diversity out there. So this is a slide kind of showing those example seed mixes. If you're re-enrolling and you have kind of a monotypic stand of brome, which is fairly common in this state, you're kind of not really getting any points. You're getting 0 points for that cover type out there. As you go up the ladder there a little bit, you can see as you get into 2 or 3 species mixes, you get 10 points, and then up into the 4, you get the 40 points. But like I said, they're kind of hayfield mixes. Timothy, orchard grass, brome, and a clover is a fairly common mix that's being put on the landscape. So the CP2 native grasses, I'm kind of taking that next step in the diversity. These are pretty decent little prairies. They're really dense, heavy on grass, and in general, think of the DNR wildlife management areas around the state with the taller grass. That's what you're looking at. Seed mixes for this are going to be 2 to 5 grasses and 3 forbs. They're medium cost to establishment. Seed mixes are going to be probably 70 to 150 bucks an acre for this. But it's going to require a little more site prep and a little bit more management than a CP1. You're going to need a clean, weed-free site bed before planting. We prefer soybeans if at all possible. But if you have sod or hayfield, something like that, you're going to be doing multiple applications of herbicide and or some tillage to get that into shape for planting. A CP2 is going to require a mid-contract management activity. I'm going to say it for all the native plantings, but burning is our preferred method, with kind of mowing as our normal alternative there. There are some options for interseeding, grazing, and haying as well, but they're a little bit more complicated. Like I said, landowners responsible for invasive species control. This is one that we're going to try and hammer home. It's not just a management activity. It's not just a plant it and forget it sort of sign up that you're going into. So you are going to be responsible for some annual maintenance. And the big benefit of going to a 2/1 is you start to get a little bit more wide variety of wildlife benefits, taller, thicker grasses, just better overall habitat. So this is the kind of the seed mix criteria for that. Like I mentioned before, it's somewhere between 2 and 5 grasses and 3 forbs. You could have an existing monoculture stand. We see this from time to time. Those 10 or 20-year-old CRP plantings that are being re-enrolled are monotypic, big blue stem. So over time, these do tend to degrade a little bit, but with good management, they can stay pretty good. I should probably mention mix 3 and 4 are the most commonly used on that last slide there in our areas. So big blue, little blue, Indian switch. All right, CP25, going up the ladder a little bit more, climbing diversity here in our rare and declining habitat. This is going to be kind of a little bit better wildlife habitat in general. It's going to be a little bit more costly. It's going to require a lot more site prep, same as the CP2, but with a higher forb diversity, any little competition out there is going to be pretty problematic. So really having that clean weed-free bed and doing some establishment mowings the first couple of years is going to go a long way on this. Got on here that it's best for low to moderate slopes. You can do it on some steeper slopes, but you might have some erosion concerns in the first couple of years. So adding things like companion crops or cover crops with that can help to mitigate that some. The nice part about this is when we start to get a little bit more into the diversity of the seed mixes, we can reach down into the dry or the wet soils a little bit better, just as having that diversity across the landscape. Moisture regimes helps with that. Again, it's going to require a mid-contract management activity. Burning's preferred, especially when you're starting to get into these diverse mixes with forbs, but mowing is kind of our secondary alternative there. The mixes for these are going to tend to have 5 grasses and 10 forbs. And as you can kind of see there, we don't really have just preferences anymore. Now we're starting to look at what soil type is really best for this mix, ranging from the dry to the wet. Most of the time in Wisconsin, we're going to be using either the mesic or dry mesic mix, but we do reach out into those far extents in certain areas. CP38E, or state acres for wildlife enhancement safe practices. Wisconsin has 6 approved areas. The largest obviously being the monarch habitat, which is kind of the southern 2/3 in the pink there. Western Prairie is the area over in the northwest in Polk and St. Croix counties, a Carner Blue area around Eau Claire, the central grasslands in Portage County, Wood County, that area, southwest grasslands in the green, and then the glacial habitat restoration area in the yellow. These are kind of targeted areas that are specifically designed seed mixes to provide habitat for species of decline in those areas. And I'm not sure if my slide is one behind. There we go. Establishments for these costs can be varied quite a bit. In certain areas, they allow for like a cool season grass planting for prairie chicken habitat in the central grasslands, or other areas are going to require like a CP25 mix, more like the Western Prairie mix, which is going to be more in the $200 range. So that varies depending upon where you're at. They all do require a mid-management activity, with the exception of some of those CP1 practices. They're going to have mostly high diversity mixes. Even the cool season mixes are incorporating forbs that are beneficial for those species, and they're targeted to provide that long-term wildlife benefit for the species in that area. The example here is of the monarch mix. It's of the 25. So this one has 3 different seed mixes that you can do. ranging from a cool season mix to a basic prairie to a diverse native prairie that's kind of exampled on the screen. Has a high percentage of milkweed in it to provide habitat for monarchs. It also is benefiting a lot of other species when we're doing this. I should mention that kind of all of your safe practices are going to score out higher in the 50-point category for the cover type, and then they will also get additional wildlife points for implementing safe practices. So if you fall into one of those areas, it's probably worth inquiring a little bit more detail about what would be involved with these plantings. CP42 pollinator habitat, definitely our most diverse and customizable CRP practice that we have in terms of grasslands. High forb diversities, most costly to establish, as it's going to be an expensive seed mix. And site prep on this is probably the most important thing, as it is with any of the native plantings. You're going to need to do a clean weed-free bed. Small grain soybeans work best. Obviously, if you're into sod, there, kind of mentioned before, there's some additional activities that are going to need to be done. But the big consideration for most landowners with 42 is the fact that prescribed burning is the required management activity for this practice. So we no longer have the option to do mowing on these. You will burn this if it's in your contract. I mentioned on the previous webinar that if you're thinking about a 42, but you're really kind of skeptical on whether or not you want to burn your practice, I would highly encourage looking at like a CP25 or one of the safe practices as a substitute. So these are going to provide long-term benefit for wildlife, honeybees. They have the highest species diversity possible. And the nice part about the customized seed mix is we can even tailor the mix to those dry or those wet sites a little bit better, as well as the landowner's goals, whether it's forage for honeybees or pheasant habitat or something like that. This is a pretty diverse seed mix example for CP2 or 42, excuse me. It has 2 native grasses in it, which is kind of the standard. And then it has a suite of forbs. We're required to have a minimum of at least 9. We try and have 3 from each bloom period. But the more the merrier. Diversity is important on these, getting flowering times throughout the year and different nectaring sources for different pollinator species. The beloved tree practices of CRP, CP3 and 3A, I'm going to kind of lump these two together. CP3 is your softwood plantings, CP3A is your hardwood plantings. Trees tend to be the highest cost for establishment, and they're probably the most intense management that you have to do. Not suitable for steep slopes or extremely wet areas. We've had a lot of problems with them drowning out when we get them into floodplains. Steep slopes, if you plant them on the contour, it works okay, but it's not highly recommended. And as everybody's probably aware, Wisconsin has a pretty high deer concentration, especially in localized areas. So tree tubes in those counties may be required, or they are going to at least be recommended. And that adds a fairly high expense to the project and kind of a yearly maintenance problem. You know, people don't check them, they get full of junk, the trees die, that sort of thing. They do provide some good long-term wildlife habitat, but they take a while to get established and get the benefits from that. And they don't require a mid-management activity anymore. So that's a change here from last year. And we mentioned this already, that the 3As, hardwood trees, can only be re-enrolled once. So that's up to 30 years in the program with that. The kind of the point score on the softwood tree plantings there is, you know, a solid stand of trees is going to get you about 10 points in that wildlife habitat. Whereas if you incorporate some shrub and grass openings with the planting, you'll get a little bit higher diversity score there. Typical species that we see planted the most are white spruce, red pine, and white pine. And the spruce is probably the most common lately, as it seems to do best with deer predation. The hardwood trees have a variety of different scores you can get, and that's based on your diversity of your planting. So a low scoring stand is probably going to be something like a solid aspen stand, whereas a higher diversity stand is going to include cherries, oaks, maples, a mixture of things. The one thing to keep in mind with the 3As is that these aren't typically done as solid hardwood plantings. They are required to have at least 50% hardwood, but most of your hardwood tree plantings will be done in a combination with a softwood and a hardwood, typically on 2 rows of hardwood and then a row of softwood as trainer trees. My personal favorite practice, and most of the office's dreaded practice, CP4D wildlife habitat. This is a good one for a lot of different species. It creates nice corridors. Really what it is it's a mixture of grass, trees, and shrubs. They're separated into different areas. It'll be 50% of the area that's selected will be in a grass planting, and 50% will include the woody species, the trees and shrubs. But it is a fairly costly practice to establish, being the tree species are included and the tree tubes are not a cost shareable item for this practice. So if you're in an area where you're going to have high deer predation, keep that in mind, or maybe look at a different alternative. So it works pretty well anywhere, best kind of again on those lower moderate slopes or on the contour. And then these are some of the practice or some of the species that are included in there. I didn't include any of the shrub trees on this list. This is mostly the shrubs. Tends to be more of the focus on this practice, but cranberries, plums, dogwoods seem to be the common species that we're looking at there. So, quick summary on kind of what we went through there. In general, the higher quality habitat is going to result in a higher EBI score. Your introduced grasses, CP1s, the safe practices that are CP1, they're going to have some lower establishment costs. They're typically going to be easier to establish, but in the long term, they're going to provide pretty low quality habitat. Whereas your native practices, your 2s, your 25s, 42s, are going to have those higher establishment costs, a little bit more intensive management, but will produce higher quality habitat in the long run. Hardwood tree practices 3P3A can only be re-enrolled once and are pretty costly to establish, but will provide long-term habitat. Same thing with the 3s, they're costly to establish. However, they can be re-enrolled multiple times, so that's one thing to consider with the softwoods. But in general, I think kind of the things that the landowner has to consider is, are you looking for cover or are you looking for wildlife habitat? So kind of got brought up in a previous call is, if I have an area that's super steep, eroding, just miserable to farm, maybe I'm really just looking to put a CP1 on there, stop that erosion, get some quick cover out there, and I'm happy. Versus the recreational landowner that's really looking for that wildlife habitat and might be doing a mixture of 3 or 4 different conservation practices on that landscape. Keep in mind that some of those practices are going to require the mid-management activity, and that the landowner is responsible for annual maintenance and invasive species control on all cover types. So what do the landowners need to consider when they're coming in? The first thing you're going to want to talk to FSA about is eligibility. Am I eligible? Are my fields eligible? And start there. Then you need to be thinking about what cover type do you want to plant. Keep in mind the equipment that you need, the time and availability you're going to have. Is my site suitable? Am I, in a super wet area that's dominated by reed canary grass? If I don't plant it, maybe I shouldn't plant pollinator habitat here. And then what are your future habitat goals for out there? Do you want the cover? Do you want the habitat? So on that note, can I complete the installation? Most producers have the ability to kind of get a 3-point attachment and plant the trees, or run a brilliant across their field and do a CP1 planting. Those aren't too complicated. It's fairly simple work. But when you get up into the pollinator habitats or the CP25s, that specialized seed mixes don't really flow well through the brilliants. The site prep needs to be a little bit more intense. Those are areas we're typically recommending hiring contractors. Not that it can't be done by yourself, but make sure you take the extra time to do the work correctly. Then your soil runner rate. Keep in mind, what are you willing to take? I mean, if I reduce my rate to get in, or do I keep it where it's at? You know, what are you going to be willing to accept on that? And then, can I conduct the annual maintenance and required management practices, or am I going to be looking for a contractor to do that as well?
Thanks, Cody. Just to kind of finish up everything here, we will just kind of walk through some of the options that folks have for a continuous sign up. And these are less full field practices and more specific in certain areas. If any of these pique your interest as a landowner, you can ask when you're in at FSA office and ask about them. We just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that these are options that are also available through CRP. We have options for grass waterways. There we go. CP9 is the wetland scrape. So if there's a wet area, you know, that's something to consider. Oh, sorry guys, computer's thinking too hard here. The CP21 is a filter strip. So that's a grass between water and a crop field potentially. There's a riparian forest buffer, which is trees between a field and water. And then another practice that's available would be a CP43, which is the prairie strips. And so those are used to go infield to help with erosion, or possibly field ends or area opportunities to square up fields to make the machinery and farming a little easier. So those are all options in CRP as well. If going through this, you feel like CRP could be a good fit for your field, you know, recommend calling your local farm service agency, the office, to set up an appointment, or you can call any of the Farm Bill biologists throughout the state with any additional questions. And, you know, we'd be happy to help, you know, especially if you're kind of trying to figure out which cover types you'd like, and we can, you know, get you to the right FSA folks and help you with your contract. So at this time, we will open the floor for some questions.
So Mike asked if Gretchen's going to be replaced soon, and the answer of that is yes. Savannah actually started yesterday, so she should be reaching out to some local folks here soon. Brian, let's see, what type of cost sharing would be involved in a CP3 programs? So typically all the CRP is going to have cost sharing for the establishment. That's going to include site prep, planting, weed and insect control, so any mowing that needs to be done the first year, the seed or trees themselves. And then the thing with the CP3s, 3As would be tree tubes, but that's dependent upon what county you're in, whether they're authorized or not.
And up to 50% of that cost, right, Cody?
Correct, up to 50%. There's rate caps and limits there. You know, if somebody comes in and says they charge $200 an acre to mow their field for site prep, we might not be able to cost share all of that. But in general, it's about 50% cost share. There's another good question in the chat that was answered already, but I'm going to go through it. Can we make substitutions for species in a CP2 mix? The only customizable mixes are for the CRP safe projects and the pollinator habitat. In the past, we've had to make substitutions for CP2 practices on availability basis, but we can't do it because of a landowner interest.
Anybody else out there? We should try to stump Cody and Ian with some questions here. So,
do you see a question for a continuous sign-up CRP filter strip? If it is expired and left out a year and the CRP cover is maintained, is it eligible to be re-enrolled again? It would not be eligible under the CRP continuous sign-up because one of the requirements for the CRP and continuous is having a resource need. So having that cover out there already would be solving the resource need. So we would not be able to bring that back in at this time to the CRP continuous.
See, there's a question on wetland scrapes and what they consist of. Tally, I think you're on the call and you deal with wetland restorations much more than I do. Would you mind jumping in on that one?
Sure. So wetland scrapes are shallow water bodies designed to benefit wildlife. So some of the considerations with those is they have a maximum depth of 4 feet and they've got 8-to-1 side slopes on them. Again, providing that water body resource on a landscape that's friendly for wildlife. And those are something that would be done in areas, you know, one of the considerations, of course, is having hydric or those wet soils.
Perfect, thanks. Mike asked, can seed be added outside of what's prescribed in the contract? And Ian can correct me if I'm wrong, but you should be able to add an enhanced seed to your CRP project above and beyond what is required, but it will not be cost shared.
That is correct. And if you are looking to add seed, I would definitely recommend reaching out to NRCS, FSA, or any TSP so we can make sure that's included in the modified CPO and come into no compliance issues.
Yeah, I'm going to let you take that next one. A 21 next to a 9.
So I do not see that happening because the filter strip should be filtering eligible water bodies, and that's going to be in general a flowing water body, and the CP9 wouldn't fit that.
I'll ask a question that came up in a conversation with someone that was on this call. For CRP, Ian, if we have a ditch that's perennial flowing or intermittent flowing, how does that terms of eligible water source? Does it have to be mapped somewhere or just documenting that it has flow?
I would say in most instances when we have the TSP do that site visit, if we can document that we have the flow there, that should suffice. Again, you know, I don't want to say that's going to fit for all circumstances because on a case-by-case scenario, it might be slightly different, but if we can get that documented and there is that resource need, then we should be able to move ahead with the filter strip there.
I could be wrong, but thinking back to this question about a CP21 being next to a 9, I think that the 9s include some seeding around the scrapes within that practice.
I would concur with that as well.
Is there anything else? Any more questions out there? Well, if not, we'll have this recording available to those of you that are on the call, and try to include, especially for landowners that are on, we'll try to include some of the maps that we had in the PowerPoint, just so you can take a closer look at them if you need to. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, and hope everybody learned a little something.